As talks continue on, a potential final offer from President Trump about this, a potential ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And this comes in light of what we just saw overnight as Zelensky posting this on social media saying debris removal operations still ongoing in Kyiv following the Russian missile strike. The relatives and loved ones of those who may still be trapped under the rubble are there on the scene of this rescue operation. A dozen people tragically losing their lives in that. Plenty to get to here on Live Now from Fox revolving around this. Let's bring into the conversation right now senior fellow at the FDD, Peter Doran. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And of course, we saw earlier on today on Truth Social, President Trump saying to Putin, stop following this attack. Do you think those words will have any impact at all on this?
Well, Andy, if only that was the secret to stopping this war, was simply to ask Vladimir Putin to stop. I think the world has done that for several years now. But look, Trump is clearly not happy, and he shouldn't be. If Vladimir Putin was interested in peace, then he has a very violent way of showing it. Just look at the last 24 hours. Trump slams Zelensky online for being the obstacle to peace. But let's recall, it's Zelensky who has accepted all of Donald Trump's ceasefire proposals without restrictions. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin keeps piling on new restrictions and adding new poison pills into the negotiation process. Trump is clearly committed to ending the killing, but Putin's bombing campaign against innocent Ukrainians shows that he is signaling his contempt for Trump and rejecting these olive branches while the velvet gloves remain on.
Yeah, and potentially one of those conditions of the final offer is that Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO. And Peter, stick with us because we do have the NATO Secretary General speaking right now in Washington, D.C. Let's listen into this briefly here on Live Now from Fox to hear his comments.
The U.S. is walking. I'm seeing a situation where under President Trump's leadership, this could be brought to a positive end. And that is very important, and I really want to thank him for that.
Do you think that Russian president wants to make peace?
I don't know. I worked with him for 4 years, between 2010 and 2014, when I was Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and I stopped trying to read his mind. You mean President Putin? Huh? President Putin. You meant the Russian president?
Yeah.
Yes. So I worked with him for 4 years, between 2010 and 2014. I stopped trying to read his mind. We'll see, but there is something on the table now, I think, where the Ukrainians are really playing ball. I think the ball is clearly in the Russian court now.
Is it accurate to say that you urged U.S. officials not to pressure Ukraine into accepting a peace deal that favors Russia?
No, it's not accurate, no.
Do you think, Mr. Secretary General, thank you, Mr. Secretary General. How much are you encouraging other NATO allies to spend on their defense? What would you like that percentage to be?
Yes, it has to be considerably higher than this famous 2%, which we wanted to achieve by 2024. We have seen the last couple of days countries like Belgium and Spain and Italy saying we will reach the 2% in time for the summit. So that is not 2024, but close. But clearly with 2%, we cannot defend NATO territory. It has to be considerably higher. And I've said before, it has to be considerably north of 3%. And this is based not on an assumption, but based on careful planning. We know exactly which capabilities we need to reach. We know the gaps there are to keep NATO territory safe. And the good thing is that by spending so much more on the Canadian-European side, we will equalize with what the US is paying on its defense. And that means that with Trump 45, what we have seen is now hundreds of billions, now in total 700 billion spent more on defense on aggregate. But this will indeed bring in not billions, but trillions more for the coming years.
Did the president commit to maintaining the level of American troops in Europe as they are now? Did you talk about the American presence in military bases there?
No, as you know, the US has to take care of many theaters, including the Middle East, including the Indo-Pacific. And I said before, since President Obama, there has been a pivot towards Asia. The question here is, how do you make sure that the US is capable of making sure that you take care of all these areas, and at the same time that collectively we defend the Euro-Atlantic area? That's exactly what we're working on. So there is a total commitment of the US to NATO, a total commitment to the famous Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, but also clearly a commitment that we have to speed up the spending in Europe, do more ourselves, so that for the US it is possible for them to spend more time and resources on the Indo-Pacific, which I think is logical.
Based upon your conversations that you've had here in Washington with the Defense Secretary, with President Trump. From your take, do they understand the threat that President Putin has on Europe as a whole, not just on Ukraine, but Europe as a whole, even to countries that aren't in NATO, like Moldova?
We all agree in NATO that Russia is the long-term threat to NATO territory, to the whole of the Euro-Atlantic territory.
Are you concerned about Turkey?
The president was asked about concessions. Are you aware of any concessions from the Ukrainians or the Russians? And should the Ukrainians be concerned that a deal won't be in their favor?
Well, you know, when you are in peace talks, somehow you have to negotiate. But I think I'm not helping a successful conclusion of these talks. And I really believe that some huge steps have been taken over the last couple of days. And the London meeting yesterday was successful. But I don't think it helps if I start to comment on itsy-bitsy bits of it. It doesn't work, so I'm not going to do that.
Madam, what was your message to the president when it comes to Crimea, in terms of Ukraine keeping that or not? What was your message to the president?
Again, these talks are ongoing. It doesn't work, and it doesn't help if I'm going to comment on every aspect of talks and what might be on the table or not. So I don't want to do that. I think we're going. Thank you so much. This was very special. See you next time.
All right, just listening in there to NATO Secretary General talking outside of the White House. Let's bring back in Peter Doran from the FDD, because as we were talking about that prior to it, about President Trump on Truth Social saying stop to Putin. You heard there from the NATO Secretary General that he's, quote, stopped trying to read the mind of Putin. You also heard comments there about Crimea, and that's another key component to this. How much of a red line, how much of a deal breaker is Crimea in this? Because it goes against U.S. policy to say that this belongs to Russia. What do we make of this, and how much of a deal breaker could it be?
Well, it's absolutely a deal breaker, Andy, and that's why I mentioned Vladimir Putin's poisoned pills earlier. We saw a little bit of that from Shevchenkivsky right now. Here's the problem. Back in 2017, the U.S. Congress passed a law, and Donald Trump signed that law, saying that the United States should not ever recognize Russia's illegal land grab in Crimea. And for good reason. If the United States starts going around normalizing every invasion and land grab, we risk endless war. So that's what the Trump administration should be trying to avoid here. Obviously, Vladimir Zelensky, it's in the Constitution that he can't give up this territory, nor should he. So we definitely see Vladimir Putin trying to insert these poison pills into the negotiation process. And, you know, Andy, it reminds me a lot of what John F. Kennedy once said about the Russians. Their negotiating strategy is to say what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. That's what Trump is dealing with right now.
It is so very interesting when you talk about that, as this kind of brought back up, and it could be such a deterrent to peace in that region. I want to ask you, because Vice President J.D. Vance also said there's a possibility that the United States will walk away if something doesn't come to fruition very recently. You also heard there from the Secretary General of NATO saying they understand the long-term threat of Russia in Europe. How dangerous would it be if the United States did ultimately walk away?
Well, if we walked away from the peace negotiations, Vladimir Putin's response would be, don't threaten me with a good time. Vladimir Putin gains very little from peace. He has consistently shown he intends to pursue this war. On one hand, he gets on the phone with President Trump and communicates that he wants peace. And on the other hand, he launches bombardment after bombardment against Ukrainian civilians. Clearly, his actions don't match his words. If President Trump is truly serious about forging a breakthrough in the peace process, I believe it's time to take off those velvet gloves and apply the pressure that he's long threatened he would use against Vladimir Putin. The goal here is to show American strength, not weakness, at the negotiation table.
Yeah, and let's get into some of those, because you also heard from NATO Secretary General saying they're not going to discuss some of these negotiations with the media in the public, and rightly so. They were also asked inside the Oval Office, President Trump was about potential sanctions. What could sanctions look like against Russia, and how maybe impressionable can they be in the talks about peace?
Well, and when it comes to sanctions, the United States and its allies have a lot more throttle left in the engine that we can apply to the peace process. Here's two examples. One, applying secondary sanctions on those banks and trading companies that help Russia facilitate evasion of our sanctions that have been on Russia since the start of this expanded invasion. Secondary sanctions is like a nuclear economic weapon. You have to use it very carefully, but when you do, it can be very effective. Additionally, we need to close the loophole that the Biden administration set for the Russians when it comes to selling oil. It's called the oil price cap. It basically allows the Russians not to worry about sanctions so long as they sell above a certain price point. Price point's far too high. We have to get it closer to the true cost of Russian oil production. So applying secondary sanctions and lowering the oil price cap on Russia, which will deny Putin the money he needs to wage his war against Ukrainians. That's how Donald Trump can take off those velvet gloves and show the Russians he means business.
You also mentioned two things that I want to bring up. We talked about Iran and the nuclears, but also about former President Joe Biden. And I want to put up this post from my colleague Andrew Kraft saying the stop to Putin is very reminiscent of Biden's don't to Iran, both in their rhetorical force and their also futile ineffectiveness. Do you agree with that in terms of what was posted on social media, that social media and waging of words in a way like that is futile, that it might not have a lot weight, it may be counterproductive to all of this?
Yeah, Vladimir Putin is certainly the kind of man who does not respond to words. He responds to action. He responds to demonstrations of strength. On one hand, it's useful as a signaling mechanism. When Donald Trump speaks, the world certainly listens. But for a president like Vladimir Putin, who's dealt with American presidents before, and he's manipulated many of them, for Vladimir Putin, actions will speak louder than words. And when it comes to the actions Trump can take, certainly ratcheting up economic pressure on Russia would get Vladimir Putin's attention.
Yeah, and another point and another question to the NATO Secretary General is about American presence in the region, and that would be a big action against Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Do you think that is even a possibility, and possibly what would that showcase? I certainly believe it might be of strength, but what in your eyes would it showcase?
Well, right now, Europeans are very nervous that the United States is going to pull up stakes in Europe and bring our American soldiers that are currently stationed in Europe back to the United States. We got some indication of that when Secretary Hegseth issued his interim guidance to the Department of Defense. His guidance was to, quote, assume greater risk in Europe. That means by pulling out of Europe, we assume a greater chance that conflict could erupt there. So Europeans are nervous. They're looking to see signaling from the United States. Perhaps the worst of all possible scenarios here is that we just disengage completely. We pull out of the peace process and leave the Europeans to their own devices.
Yeah, that is a very good point. I do want to put up more tweets here more posts from Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, saying it's been 44 days since Ukraine agreed to a full ceasefire and a halt to the strikes. This was the proposal from the United States. It's been 44 days of Russia continuing to kill our people and evading tough pressure, accountability for its actions. Also, the most recent one. And in the post, he said, according to preliminary information, the Russians used ballistic missiles manufactured in North Korea. He goes on to say if the information that the missile was made in North Korea is confirmed, it would be further proof of the criminal nature of the alliance between Russia and North Korea. In your eyes, with the concrete evidence continuing to line up and the link between Russia and North Korea, what would that signal?
Well, on one hand, it signals that Russia is running out of ammunition. It's not just potentially ballistic missiles that the Russians from North Korea that the Russians are using. We know they've been using North Korean artillery shells. And obviously, they've been using North Korean soldiers in World War I style human wave attacks that are just catastrophic for the North Korean soldiers. So obviously, Russia is running low on manpower, ammunition, equipment, all of the things that the United States should be the pressure points where the United States can and should be squeezing by, as I said, ratcheting up the economic pressure on Putin's war machine. You do that, and you can force Vladimir Putin to take the peace negotiations far more seriously than he has. Otherwise, Andy, the bombing of Ukrainian civilians will continue until we change course. And Putin's actions over the last 40 days or so has demonstrated that.
Yeah, I think the attack last night there in Ukraine, killing more than a dozen people, certainly signals that, and maybe the talks, the negotiations, how they stand at this point. I do want to ask you my last question before I let you go, because as we're talking about all these different factors, we heard from the Norwegian Prime Minister, we heard from the NATO Secretary General about is peace possible in the region. Do you believe that's real? Do you think peace is ultimately possible there?
Peace is certainly possible if we come to terms with the fact that Vladimir Putin will not willingly act in good faith at the peace table. If we force Putin to come to terms with our strength, both as the United States alone and with our allies, using our economic power, our militaries, and intelligence assistance that we're providing to the Ukrainians, if we show him our strength is greater than his ability to sustain this war, we can have a breakthrough, but we have to do it on our terms, not Putin's.
All right, and potentially the final offer there from President Trump about this, and we'll see if some of those concessions by Ukraine, as we mentioned, potentially a deal breaker with Crimea, have any weight, or if we pull back on that. All right, Peter, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight. A big development today in terms of this. We'll see where the negotiations go over the next couple of weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andy.
All right, thank you so much. All right.